My name is Holt Greer. I run the Greer spread north of Millhaven, which has been in my family since my grandfather broke the ground here in 1861. I will tell you that when my wife Pauline died of fever in August of 1884, I became a man who ran a ranch and nothing else. Not a bad man, not a hard man, simply a man with no particular plans beyond the next season's work and the next year's market. What I had was a house that was functionally running but practically unlivable. A 12-year-old son named Thomas, who needed someone other than me to talk to, and a deed situation involving my late wife's family that I do not need to detail here beyond saying it was the sort of thing that required a legal wife in residence for the property line to hold. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. What I proposed to Clara Dunmore was not romantic, it was practical. She was the schoolteacher in Millhaven, had come out from Iowa 2 years prior, 1886, at 27 years old, and had been running the schoolhouse since. She was steady, intelligent, capable of managing a household, and she had a quality of deliberateness about her. She did not speak until she had thought, and when she thought, it showed. Thomas liked her from the class she'd taught him, which I took as a reasonable endorsement. I went to her boarding house in February of 1888, and I laid it out plain. I told her the deed situation. I told her I needed a wife in legal residence, and that I was not in a position to offer anything beyond a solid house, a fair wage, and a man who would leave her to her own devices and not make her life harder than it was. I said I understood if the arrangement was not suitable. I said I appreciated her time. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "What happens to Thomas if you don't resolve the deed situation?" I said, "He loses the property his grandfather built." She said, "That is a sufficient reason to consider it." She asked me 4 questions. Whether she could keep her teaching post, whether she would have independence in the management of the house, whether Thomas had any say in the matter, and whether I intended to be honest with her. I said yes to all 4. She said she would give me an answer in 2 days. She gave me her answer in 1 day. It was yes with conditions attached on paper, which she handed me in an envelope. I read them. They were sensible. I signed them. We were married in March at the courthouse in Millhaven, with the justice of the peace and 2 witnesses who were not friends of mine, but strangers who happened to be present and agreed to sign the register. Clara wore a gray dress she already owned. I wore clean clothes. There was no ceremony to speak of. We drove back to the ranch in the same wagon I had come to town with. She sat with her 2 bags and the crate of books she had brought from the boarding house. She looked at the property as we came over the last rise, the same way she looked at most things, which was thoroughly and without comment until she had finished looking. She said, "The south fence needs work." I said, "I know." She said, "The kitchen garden hasn't been turned." I said, "I know." She said, "All right." That was her first assessment of the property she had married into for reasons of practicality, not a complaint, an observation delivered for the purpose of planning. The first 3 months were exactly what I had proposed. She ran the house with an efficiency that improved conditions in measurable ways that I noticed but did not remark on. She kept her teaching post. She managed Thomas's schooling with a particular patience that I found impressive, given that Thomas at 12 had opinions about his own education that were not always aligned with the education itself. She was present at meals and absent otherwise, which suited us both. I want to tell you what changed, because I've thought about how to say it, and I think the honest answer is that it changed slowly and then was obvious. There was no moment I can point to except the one in June. I had come in from the east fence line late on a Thursday in June, which had been a hot week and a long day, and I found Clara in the kitchen with a ledger open on the table and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, working through the accounts. She did not hear me come in. She was working a column of figures with the same quality of absorption she brought to everything, entire and unhurried. There was a lamp burning and the window was open and the evening had cooled. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I was aware that I had not stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and simply been in the room without a task since sometime before Pauline died. The room felt like a room again. That was the only way I could put it to myself. I said, "You stayed up." She looked up. She said, "The June figures needed balancing before the market." I said, "You didn't have to do that tonight." She said, "I know, I wanted to finish it." I said, "Thank you." She looked at me in the particular way she had, not assessing, not guarded, just present and direct. She said, "You're welcome." I went to bed. I thought about it for a while. Over the following months I found reasons to be in rooms where she was, not arranged reasons. Simply the natural course of a man who has started paying attention to where in the house a particular person is. She noticed, I think. She did not say anything about it for a long time, which was consistent with her general approach to things she was still thinking through. In October, she said at supper without preamble, "I want to tell you that the arrangement has been satisfactory," I said, "for me as well." She said, "I mean that I have found it more than satisfactory." I looked at her. She was looking at her plate, which was the closest thing I had seen to her being uncertain, which was not a quality she displayed often. I said, "I find it considerably more than satisfactory." She looked up. I said, "I am aware that is not what we agreed to." She said, "No, it isn't." I said, "I would like to renegotiate the terms if you're open to it." She said, "I'd want that in writing as well." I said, "Naturally." She held out her hand across the table. I shook it. It was not the way most people seal that kind of agreement, but it was our way, and it was the truest thing that had happened in my house in 4 years. We renegotiated the terms in the sense that we had a conversation that lasted 2 hours and covered several things that I will not reproduce here because they were ours. The revised understanding was not written down. We decided it didn't need to be. Thomas found out the following morning when I set an extra plate at the table for no reason, and Clara did not remark on it, and they looked at each other, and he said, "Finally." He has said that exact word on 3 separate occasions in his life when the thing he had been waiting for happened. I did not know he had been waiting for this one. I should have known. Thomas has always paid attention. The deed situation was resolved in November, which was what the arrangement had been for. The property line held. The spread is still Greer land. That is the practical version. The true version is that I went to a schoolteacher's boarding house in February with a legal problem, and I came home with a woman who balanced my accounts on a Thursday evening when she didn't have to, and who held out her hand across a supper table in October, and who, when I asked her to stay beyond the terms of what we'd agreed, said she would want it in writing. And I said naturally, and I meant it, because that is who she is, and knowing who she has turned out to be the best thing I know. The south fence held all winter. She was right about that too.